And now it's time to violate the jurisdiction of this week's biggest bogon emitter. 4 senators have called upon the Justice Department to investigate News Corporation, the parent company of Fox News, on charges of hacking cell phones and bribing public officials. What's wrong with that? Get this. The alleged crimes didn't even happen in the U.S.
Meet Shane Killian. Many of you have heard of him and remember him for his Bogosity series on YouTube. I used to be a subscriber. Not anymore. What you have just heard was the beginning of his rant about the investigation of News Corporation and what will turn out to be a whole lot of nonsense on his part. He opens this segment of his podcast with the statement that the crimes didn't even happen in the US. This is an invalid point, and I will explain why, but this is ignoring the fact also that there is suspicion that some of the crimes did occur on US soil. For now, let's listen on.
They happened in the UK, with reporters working for News of the World, a news outlet owned by News Corporation. Crimes that take place in other countries must be investigated and prosecuted by officials in that other country. Our government does not get to charge them with anything just because their parent company is in the US.
So, what is wrong with this picture? This individual thinks he is a constitutional scholar. Further, he thinks that he's always right and that everyone who disagrees with him is wrong. This is evident in every single video he has ever made addressing his opponents or critics, often laced with epithets like
stupid, this idiocy, oh the stupidity, can't take it, they'll even lie,
and so on. He likes to compare people who disagree with him to creationists and moon hoaxers, and even when he is wrong about something, he will continue to do it, projecting his own dishonesty and behavioural characteristics onto whoever he is arguing against at the time. He has done this to me on 2 separate occasions. I'll come back to this at the end of my analysis of this rant of his. Now I want to get to the meat of the issue. News Corporation's actions, the investigations the US wishes to carry out, and that it is supposedly unconstitutional. Mr. Killian has made a claim that the US does not have any legal standing to prosecute crimes committed outside of the US. He will go on to give his explanation why in a short while, and having consulted with others on the subject, I am prepared to explain why he has gotten this wrong. But make no mistake, he is wrong. Let's listen further.
And they have the audacity to charge News Corporation with breach of ethics? How about breach of justice, breach of proper jurisdiction, breach of due process?
Yes. How about providing evidence that any of these claims are actually valid and applicable here? Making statements to this effect when you don't know what you are talking about only serves to harm your own cause. Now, my knowledge of the Constitution is somewhat limited, so I'm not able to argue this for myself, but I knew that there was something wrong with a claim made that investigating News Corporation was a breach of justice and process. I have a copy of the Constitution digitally stored, and I signed up with a forum in which the sole purpose is to discuss constitutional issues such as this one. I'll come back and explain further after the following clip.
They want the DOJ to investigate to see if News Corp violated the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, specifically the part prohibiting bribery of foreign officials. But I don't see anywhere in the Constitution where Congress is given the power to break down jurisdictional barriers.
There are some points I'd like to make before we go any further. First of all, the claim that the FCPA breaks down jurisdictional barriers, a claim made by Mr. Killian in the comments section of his highlights video on YouTube, is a bogus one. The reason why it is bogus was explained to me when I put this question to a moderator over at usconstitution.net and received the following explanation. It meets constitutionality because it applies to US persons and other entities over which the US government possesses in personam jurisdiction. Point number 2. Article 1, Section 8 includes the following provision. To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offences against the law of nations. The explanation I was given was that this applies to the US legislative branch and its ability to formulate laws that would cover criminal acts committed outside of US territory, such as piracy and felony crimes. Since these powers are enumerated in the Constitution, the US has the right to formulate laws governing out-of-country conduct by entities resident in the US. The last point was explained to me further. If you live in the US, maintain a business in the US, or are present in the US in a manner that is systematic, continuous, and in a manner that does not violate traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice, then the US government can regulate you and your activities outside of the forum state. This not only applies to persons but to corporations. I was also given an example. Let's say I live in New Jersey. I'm married, and let's say that my wife and I go to Bermuda and I kill my wife in Bermuda. The fact of the matter is that my wife and I have sufficient jurisdictional nexus where I could be tried for her murder in New Jersey. This is not to say, of course, that the Bermudan authorities cannot also try me, because they can, but so can New Jersey. Additionally, the FCPA is consistent with an international treaty which I have been provided a helpful link for. See the info bar. And finally, I was also provided a portion of the United States Code Title 15 Chapter 2B Section 78B. Much of what's important within this paragraph that was enumerated to me is concerning the emails and instrumentalities of interstate commerce and the current and of any securities of issuers engaged in interstate commerce, as well as anything that affects the national credit. Emphasis on this paragraph was provided by the moderator at usconstitution.net, and the full text of this title, chapter and section had been provided in the info bar.
Someone bribing foreign officials on American soil or while working for the American government is one thing, but people who don't even live here bribing officials in a completely different country is a reason for the U.S. to claim jurisdiction just because the company that owns them is from the U.S.?
Yes, as I explained previously. Once again, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act meets constitutionality because it applies to US persons and other entities over which the US government possesses in personam jurisdiction. Rupert Murdoch spends a great deal of his time in the US. News Corporation is an international company with offices that are based within the US, including their headquarters. Provided a link can be made between News International and News Corporation in relation to the bribery issue, then he can be prosecuted under the FCPA. What Mr. Killian has failed to realise is that if the FCPA were unconstitutional, then it would have failed the multiple challenges that it has so far faced from prosecutions against entities that have already violated it. There are problems with the FCPA, such as how easy it is for companies to settle out of court. All they have to do is put the blame on somebody from the company, throw that person under the bus, and pay a hefty fine, and they can avoid prosecution. This is something that needs to be resolved, but it does not mean that the FCPA is unconstitutional in and of itself, which is what Mr. Killian has suggested to me.
Give me a break. This is just a transparent attempt to undermine Rupert Murdoch's corporation just because they don't like what they say.
Give me a break. Mr. Killian is giving an opinion as if it were fact, that this is all just a stunt to take down News Corporation because they don't like what he's saying. He doesn't actually know this, no matter what he claims. No one really knows for sure, but there is legitimate suspicion that News Corporation is up to something and has been for some time. There is currently a question over whether some of the phone hackings that took place at the behest of News of the World took place on US soil, namely that of 9/11 victim families, which is outside the scope of the FCPA and would likely need to be investigated under other statutes. But even then, that is legally investigatable by the FBI, since it is more than likely that some of these hackings took place via US-owned technologies on US territory and or involving US citizens, even if the targets were intended to be British people involved in or related to victims of 9/11. Mr. Killian has not demonstrated either that this is a stunt against News Corporation or that there is any reason to discount the possibility that News Corporation may have been responsible for what happened in the hackings and the bribery attempts. Let's move on.
Well, hey, I don't like most of what they say either, but in this country you have freedom of the press. It's enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution, and although Britain doesn't have a written constitution, it has an even longer tradition of a free press. That tradition is undermined by a witch hunt.
A witch hunt, Mr. Killian? And you talk about due process and justice? You have just made an assumption that you have no substantial evidence for, not even probable cause to assume. Hypocrisy seems to be your bag. Let's move on.
If people at News of the World hacked phones and bribed officials, and their actions go beyond the free press protections afforded by the system, then by all means prosecute them for it, in Britain, under the applicable British laws, and let the people who are directly harmed by them sue in civil court. But don't misuse the system of justice to try to take down those who hold opposing opinions.
Once again, Mr. Killian has toted his silence dissenters nonsense. I'm beginning to wonder if he's paranoid. It would seem that way given that he has now on 3 occasions in this piece accused the US senators calling for an investigation of trying to engage in a witch hunt. Do you have any evidence of this one taking place, Mr. Killian? No, of course you don't.
As we quoted fictional lawyer Alan Shore last week, the only way you can get there is schadenfreude. And that is why, for undergoing this blatant misuse of the justice system, Senators Jay Rockefeller, Barbara Boxer, Frank Lautenberg, and Peter King are this week's biggest bogon emitters.
So what did we learn? Not really a lot. He has essentially accused, tried, and convicted his dissenters as he has always done without bothering to get his facts straight first. An accusation that he has levelled against his critics, including myself. So, rather than demonstrate that these senators have called for a breach of the justice system, he has simply demonstrated that he hasn't the first clue what he's talking about. So let's discuss a few more points before I close out this video. The British justice system are investigating the bribery claims already. The information that they need to provide is probable cause that News Corporation are complicit in the activities of the bribery and phone hacking scandals on British territory. Once they've done this, then, under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the US is constitutionally permitted to act. Mr. Killian has claimed that the FCPA is unconstitutional because it gives the US government power to cross jurisdictional barriers, but he hasn't given a sufficiently adequate explanation for why this is, and instead has resorted to childish nonsense and games when called on it. Now let's move on to the comments section of the highlights video for this podcast, and then I'll explain why he hasn't provided a sufficient explanation for his position on these issues. First of all, I hold my hands up and say that I didn't conduct myself too well, although I would add that his insulting manner, his elitist tone, and his belief that he is better than anyone who disagrees with him really gets on my nerves and rubs me out the wrong way. I don't mind telling you that he annoys me with his behaviour, and it showed in my responses. Secondly, I'm not one for thoroughly reading comments, and this is a weakness on my part. I gloss over them a lot when I'm responding, especially when it's a quick fire back and forth, as was the case here. This has led to many mistakes on my part, which are clear to see in the comments section. So why do I even bother mentioning it? This individual decided to immediately jump to a conclusion and play the dishonesty card, calling me a liar, claiming that I'm either being willingly dishonest or that there's something psychologically wrong with me. This is the kind of nonsense I had to deal with in the comment section of my video on free market healthcare, something I intend to revisit in my next video. For clarification, I have never deleted comments from any of my videos unless one of the following conditions were true. Under all other circumstances, the comment remains on the video for the life of the video. I have also never removed a video from my channel. The closest I have ever come is in making videos private for a time, and in the case of the aforementioned video, I never did this once. These points are made to address the claim by another user that I removed comments and took down videos as some means of hiding arguments from a user who has also posted on the video in question. This never happened. Every comment is still there, including comments I wish I had written differently. And regarding key comments that were made, it has been suggested to me that there is a need for a link between the suspects directly involved in the bribery scandal and News Corporation via News International. This is understandable and is a point I agree with. There's nothing wrong with that. However, Mr. Killian's argument is that the FCPA is unconstitutional because it crosses jurisdictional barriers, except he's conveniently forgotten to tell his listeners that the FCPA cannot be used as a club to prosecute people who have no links to US corporations and who are not already under US jurisdiction, nor would be. He has forgotten to tell his listeners that it is already likely that if a link is not found between the Murdochs, News Corporation, News International and the people who committed the crimes of bribery, then the FCPA doesn't apply. There is no dispute in this. That doesn't make the FCPA itself unconstitutional. And even if it did, there are other laws that would then have to be overturned, such as those covering the example I was given earlier in the video about prosecuting US citizens for crimes committed overseas. Should we just forget about trying US citizens who murder other people just because they're on foreign soil? The US has constitutionally granted jurisdiction to prosecute and bring a case against their own people, as well as those it has in personam jurisdiction over, even if they commit crimes on foreign soil, and there is precedent for this dating back decades and perhaps even centuries for some crimes. So, in summary, this is not a valid argument against investigating News Corporation for criminal activities overseas, and no amount of paranoid conspiracy theorizing is going to change that. The FCPA has been successfully used in bringing criminal cases to the courts in the USA since its inception in 1977, many of them cases against high-profile businesses that have the resources to challenge the constitutionality of the FCPA if it were ever in question, and yet it still exists. It has been strengthened by the fact that the US government went out of its ways to formulate a treaty with the rest of the international community, and the FCPA remains legally binding today. What Mr. Killian has failed to answer, despite my asking him repeatedly, is if the constitutionality of the FCPA were in question, why hasn't it been challenged on that basis? Why doesn't he do something about it? Because he's wrong. Though I doubt he will ever admit it, he just isn't that kind of guy. He'll call me a liar, an idiot, a moron, and a creationist or a moon hoaxer before that ever happens. My next video addressed to Mr. Killian will be on the subject of the NHS in his previous podcast.